Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and on this Wednesday evening, I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. Dalia, Gary was telling me pretty weird things about you about 5 minutes ago. Apparently, you love this weather.
I look, my problem is always with rain and gloominess, but I can handle like a crisp, bright, sunny, dry, cold day. Like all the fashion girlies and boys know that winter, like cold weather, is the time where you can really dress. So I actually really quite like a cold weather, but I need it to be bright and sunny. That's all I ask for.
I suppose I don't mind it when the sun is shining. It's just walking my dog back at night. I feel cold. I feel like I'm going to get sick. I've started making homemade pho, which was making the winter sort of better. But yesterday, I think I had so much of it that I ended up with a hangover just from all the soy sauce. I don't know if anyone watching this with medical knowledge knows if that's a plausible sequence of events, but there we are. We've got lots to talk about today. Coming up on tonight's show, we will be discussing the mother and father of the House of Commons coming out against assisted dying, whether the farmers' protesters are actually a front for Britain's land-holding super elite. Very much an open question. I'm not necessarily saying that everyone on those protests was or is. We'll also discuss Bernie Sanders introducing a bill to suspend U.S. military support for Israel. Very important bill. I suppose no prizes for guessing how the U.S. Senate will vote on it, though. Ukraine has, for the first time, fired British-made long-range missiles into Russian territory. Bloomberg reports that a Western official has confirmed the first cross-border use of the Storm Shadow missiles. Jointly designed and manufactured by Britain and France, the Storm Shadow missiles can be launched from a number of aircraft described as a long-range, conventionally armed deep strike weapon. The Storm Shadow missiles are also known as fire and forget arms. It doesn't always sound like the best idea, does it? Fire and forget. But they're called that because once programmed and launched, operators no longer need to navigate the missile to its target. Of course, the reason you shouldn't just fire and forget is because something might come back to you afterwards, I suppose. People tend to retaliate when you fire missiles at them. Ukraine, of course, has been using these weapons for a while against areas within its own country, so those parts of Ukraine occupied by Russia. And last year, the missiles are believed to have been used to strike the Chonar Road Bridge, that's a central route linking Crimea to southern Ukraine. But Britain and France have hesitated to allow their use inside Russia until now. The Storm Shadow missiles have a range of around 155 miles. That's a little less than the 190-mile range of the US-made Attack-M missiles, which we talked about on Monday's show. Biden authorized Ukraine to use those missiles, so the Attack-Ms, against Russian targets earlier this week. And on Monday night, Ukraine did. The Attack-M missiles are thought to have been used to blow up a significant arms depot about 80 miles inside Russian territory. In the wake of that attack, a number of embassies in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, were closed today after receiving, quote, specific information of a potentially significant air attack on the city. First to close its door was the American embassy, which also ordered its staff to shelter in place. While drone attacks over Kyiv are a frequent occurrence, the embassy has rarely closed down or issued warnings to its staff, so this was a significant move. And other embassies soon followed the US's example, with the Spanish, Italian and Greek embassies all closing their doors as well. The Spanish embassy even appeared to take the precaution of barricading doors and windows with sandbags. At noon today, air raid sirens also sounded around the city, but Ukraine's military intelligence agency have played down the threat, describing it as, quote, a massive informational and psychological attack against Ukraine. So they're saying this wasn't really a threat, this was just designed to scare these foreign countries. And Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a rebuke to those jittery embassies, saying this: on the 1001st day of the full-scale invasion, the threat of Russian shelling remains as relevant as it has been over the past 1,000 days. We believe it would be appropriate for our partners to respond today just as they have over the previous 1,000 days, without any additional information-driven escalation. So they're saying, you guys were too jumpy, you've got this bit of information there was going to be an attack. Now they're saying this was actually Russian disinformation designed, I suppose, to make things look more dangerous and let's say, I suppose, unpredictable than they really are. That's the message from the Ukrainians. Of course, jumpiness with regard to Russia's future actions is not entirely unwarranted. Yesterday, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a decree updating the country's nuclear protocol on its new terms. Russia says it could launch a nuclear strike against any country supplying conventional weapons to Ukraine for use in Russia's territory. So that's pretty much what's going on now. On Sky News, Kay Burley asked Ukrainian MP Kira Rudik about the nuclear threat.
We're hearing that President Putin has signed a decree to lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. How concerned are you about that?
Well, I have a backpack for the nuclear attack at my home, as many Ukrainians do. We have been afraid of the nuclear escalation since the day one, and Putin has scared us with that since the day one. We are more afraid that we will not receive the weapons in time than the threat that Putin is putting. He is delivering this message not to us, he's delivering to the West. And we hope that though everything should be taken seriously, it will not stop our allies from delivering what is so necessary for us to defend ourselves.
What's in the backpack?
There are many cans of, many items of the canned food, water, and the gloves and the socks that you have to change often, the mask, and some stuff for the family.
Despite Russia's nuclear threat, Ukraine will be receiving more new weapons from the United States. Joe Biden has agreed that the US will now supply anti-personnel mines to the country. Western allies of Ukraine have hesitated to give the country mines until now. That's because of international objections to the use of such weapons on the grounds that they pose a significant risk to civilians, sometimes long after a war has ended. But a US defense official claimed that Ukraine had agreed to use only so-called non-persistent mines. That's mines that remain active for a limited period of time. And the military has also pledged not to use them in built-up areas. Earlier today, I spoke to Anatol Lieven, Senior Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I began by asking him about the Kyiv embassy closures.
Russia is obviously, trying to frighten the West in various ways. But also, the Russians are considering how to retaliate against this permission for ATACMS to be fired into Russian territory, and also against British Storm Shadows and French Scalps if the British and French governments follow suit. And, a strike on a Western embassy in Kiev, which could then be, the Russians could say, oh, well, terribly sorry, accident, or it wasn't, it was shot down by Ukrainian anti-aircraft fire. That would be one possibility. Now, whether this is something that the Russians are considering and the West has discovered, or whether the Russians have put this out as a warning, we just don't know. But it is the kind of thing that we should be worried about, because the Russians clearly are looking for a way to hit back that won't involve hitting back directly at NATO territory, let alone the US, in a way which would automatically start a new cycle of escalation. And so there are various things they could do. This is indeed one of them.
Let's talk more about the various permissions that the West are giving to Ukraine. So on Monday, it was these ATACMS missiles. Today, the United States has announced they're giving Ukraine permission to use landmines. I think the argument is that this will stop Russian troop advances. This is fairly controversial because lots of countries have banned landmines. I don't think the United States have. What do you make of this development?
Well, the landmines make excellent sense from a Ukrainian and Western point of view. Already, when I was in Ukraine last year talking to Ukrainian veterans, they said that the battlefield was choked with mines. Mines on the Russian side helped to stop the Ukrainian offensive last year, and mines have played a key role in slowing up Russian advances. I have to say that several of the veterans I met were missing legs, to emphasize that. Yes, mines are a very useful defensive weapon. That's one key reason why the Americans haven't given them up, because the border with North Korea is laced with mines, which are considered to be a key way of stopping any North Korean offensive. Also, while, as you say, this is controversial in terms of international humanitarianism, it's not against international law, since the US and Ukraine have not signed that treaty. The use of not just Western missiles, but missiles guided by the West to attack targets inside Russia is a much bigger step, because while Russia hasn't said anything about the use of mines, and indeed couldn't, it has repeatedly talked about the firing of Western-guided missiles into Russia as a very important red line to which Russia would have to retaliate. And obviously the fear is now that through this language, Putin has trapped himself and will in fact have to do something.
And I suppose the language also extends to nuclear weapons, because they've updated their nuclear doctrine, haven't they, this week? And they've said that we consider it that we are at war with a nuclear state if a nuclear state backs a non-nuclear state to fight a war with us, I suppose, or shoot things into our territory, which is what's happening this week. And he's also said we sort of reserve the right to respond with nuclear weapons to a conventional attack. So, I mean, how seriously should we take sort of Putin, I suppose, saber rattling when it comes to nuclear weapons? Or is it just saber rattling, or is this sort of genuinely a statement of intent?
It's not that the Russians are going to start firing nuclear weapons in response to ATACMS or storm shadows. But I mean, what the Russians are afraid of, and this is one reason why many Russians say, that they have to draw, take a red line here over the ATACMS, is that they're afraid that if they if they allow the West to pass yet another red line without retaliation, that in the end, Western countries could decide to send actual troops or Western aircraft to fight in Ukraine. For example, if the Russians break through and are actually capturing much more Ukrainian territory, well, at that point, the West would be at war with Russia. And at that point, I think there definitely would be an escalation towards the use of nuclear weapons. I mean, not immediately, but the Russians would take clear steps in that direction. So I think, this isn't a warning of immediate action, but it's a warning against escalation, which could eventually lead to that.
And is that plausible? My impression was that sort of, in a way, sort of these permissions from the United States are in part because Biden knows he's going to be leaving office soon, and Trump's going to come in with a new perspective. So even if these ATACMS escalate the situation, there's almost a sort of time limit of around 2 months until Trump gets inaugurated, and then maybe they go into peace negotiations. So it seems at this point, to me, I didn't have in my head that there's a plausible path to the West sending troops to Ukraine. I mean, do you have a sort of different perspective?
Well, I mean, not at present, no. And I don't know. I mean, I agree with you. I don't think that this is very, very serious. But, remember, Trump is a very volatile character with, shall we say, unclear ideas. He's very anxious to end this war in Ukraine. So are a lot of his supporters, if only because they want to really concentrate on China and to some extent the Middle East. But you do have to remember that Trump has also threatened that if Russia doesn't come to a peace agreement, that he will increase aid to Ukraine. And we don't know yet. We have no idea whether the peace offer that Trump will make to the Russians is actually going to be remotely acceptable to the Russians as a basis for negotiation. So, an awful lot is still completely open. That's why this question of intensified bombardment of Ukraine, possibly involving strikes on Western embassies, and these stories of sabotage in Europe, which I take to be Russian warnings, not as yet serious efforts. I think all of this is the Russians, sending warnings to the West without taking actions that would, actually precipitate another cycle of escalation. But I think the Russians do want to send warnings.
And I think lots of people have in their head at this point that once Trump comes in, he'll sit down with Putin and Zelensky and he'll say, look, I'm not sponsoring this war anymore, or I don't want to sponsor this war anymore, come to some kind of agreement. It seems to me, I mean, from what the Russians are saying, so the Kremlin spokesperson today reiterated the idea that Russia wouldn't even accept a freeze of the conflict as something that was acceptable, which means essentially that they want to control more territory than they currently control. Now, I can't imagine that being acceptable to Ukraine, or something that Zelensky could sell to the Ukrainian people, that not only are we letting the Russians keep the land they have, we're also going to retreat and give them the rest of these Ukrainian territories, which they claim for their own. So is there sort of a chance that Donald Trump, who's sort of put himself forward as a deal maker, he gets into that room and there really is no possible agreement that the two sides can come to?
Yes, I think that there is. Now, as to the Russian demand that the Ukrainians, withdraw from territory that they presently hold, yeah, I agree. That's totally impossible. The question is whether that is, a non-negotiable Russian position, or whether it's an initial bargaining position. Because you have to remember that the Ukrainian official position, although there have been heavy hints that they really don't expect this to happen anymore, but it's still the official Ukrainian position that Russia should withdraw from all the territory that it has occupied since 2014, including Crimea. Well, that is equally a total impossibility. So I think we have to start with the assumption that both sides, as in most negotiations, will start with a very hard position. And then we have to see if they will be prepared to negotiate that down. But that will also require, patience, tact, sophisticated diplomacy, and time on the part of the Trump administration. Now, these are not words that we associated with the first Trump administration. So we will have to see. I mean, one of the things we will have to see is who he chooses as his envoy to negotiate with Russia and Ukraine. One can think of some very good names, but they're not names who have been associated with Trump.
And in those negotiations, what would be the key issues? So we talked about land and the idea of what Ukraine, what is legally Ukraine's territory, and what Russia are claiming for their own. What will be the other big issues? Is it sort of whether or not Ukraine will be able to function as a successful independent state? It doesn't seem plausible to me that they're going to join NATO anytime soon. So what do you see as being the sticking points, other than where these borders, official or otherwise, are drawn?
The borders will be unofficial, I think. The Russians officially have demanded recognition, but in private, Russian officials have said to me that they know that there will be no legal recognition of their annexations. And interestingly, they say that's because they know that the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians will never legally recognize this. So I think, you will eventually get a division along, as in Kashmir or Cyprus, wherever eventually the battle line stands. On NATO membership, that appears to be an absolute Russian condition, that Ukraine must be neutral. I was told that Putin has said that so often that he simply can't back away from it. So that then leaves the question of what other guarantees can be given to Ukraine, and that will emerge in negotiations. And then, of course, there is the question of what Russia actually means by demilitarization and denazification. And the Russian demands have been very vague on that. And in the Istanbul negotiations at the start of the war, Russia began with very, very hard demands for demilitarization. It's been reported that they wanted to reduce the Ukrainian army to 50,000 men. But as their military position worsened, so the Russians started negotiating that down, or in this case, up. And so one huge question is, if, as part of a deal, if the Russians could get a treaty of neutrality and no NATO membership, would they be prepared really seriously to compromise, to reduce their demands in other areas? Logically, that's what one would expect, and that's what some Russians have told me that the Russian government would be willing to do. But all of this will only appear, we're all speculating about this, really. All of these things will only become clear once negotiations have begun.
That was Anatol Lieven speaking to me earlier today. In just over a week, Britain's Parliament will vote on a bill which would legalise assisted dying. Now, it's an incredibly contentious issue, and for many, it's a matter of conscience. That's why MPs will have a free vote. And the two longest-serving MPs have today made their views clear. Labour's Diane Abbott and the Tory Edward Lee, they're the mother and father of the House of Commons, say they'll be voting against assisted dying. And they lay out their arguments in a piece for The Guardian, where they say this: "We are concerned about how the new legislation would be implemented in practice, particularly as regards to vulnerable groups. The organisations campaigning for a change in the law have successfully used high-profile celebrities to promote the cause. We do not doubt their sincerity and sympathise greatly with anyone experiencing the fear and pain that can sadly accompany terminal illness. But MPs must make laws based on their effect on every member of society, not just those whose profile gives them a prominent voice." Now, this here to me seems to be a reference to Esther Rantzen. I don't think that's as a critique of Esther Rantzen, but she's a high-profile celebrity who's been campaigning to legalise assisted dying. And I think somewhat ridiculously, Keir Starmer, when asked by a journalist about this legislation, said he would be in favour of it going to a vote in the House of Commons because he'd made a promise to the veteran TV presenter, right? We're going to have this incredibly significant legislation be voted on, and we're going to give everyone a free vote because I promised Esther Rantzen. It wasn't his most convincing moment. The two MPs, so Abbott and Lee, go on to say this: "Evidence from elsewhere suggests those most at risk when assisted suicide," so they're calling it, that's quite emotive to call it assisted suicide instead of assisted dying, "is legalised are vulnerable minorities. Such people, unlike privileged elites who are used to exercising autonomy over every part of their lives and who can afford good quality social and palliative care, are most likely to resign themselves to an assisted death against their will because they are unable to access the support they require." So that's Abbott and Lee sort of saying, having all of these rich, famous people coming out and saying they're in favour of assisted dying, these aren't really the people we should be listening to, because these aren't the kind of people who might be subject to the kind of social pressure to go ahead with something they might not really want to do. We'll discuss in a moment whether that's a reasonable point. The MPs also criticised the speed with which the bill put forward by Labour backbencher Kim Ledbetter has been pushed through Parliament. So they say this: "When MPs last voted on this issue, less than a decade ago in 2015, Rob Marris published his private member's bill a full 7 weeks before MPs voted on the proposal at second reading, providing time for scrutiny and debate. In contrast, Kim Ledbetter's bill was published just 18 days ahead of second reading. The inadequacy of this timescale is heightened by the unprecedented number of new MPs." So saying they haven't been given much warning, and we've got lots of MPs without much experience when it comes to these sorts of things. And then they go on to say, "Parliament will have sat for just 12 weeks by the time MPs vote on what is quite literally a matter of life and death. Many MPs are still relatively unfamiliar with normal parliamentary procedure, let alone for private members' bills, of which this will be the first in this Parliament. There is more than a suspicion that the pressure groups behind this proposed change have sought to take advantage of an inexperienced new Parliament. Either way, the flawed process has been lamentable and wholly unacceptable for a matter of such importance." As far as I understand, the reason this is the first private members' bill is because Kim Ledbetter came first in a ballot. So if I'm correct, there's an element of luck here. So it's not necessarily they sort of wanted to do it at the beginning so that people wouldn't have time to find out about it. But I still think that's a reasonable argument being put forward by Abbott and Lee. We still don't know how MPs will vote next Friday. It had initially been thought that it might sail through. Now it seems like it might actually struggle. And we have heard from various cabinet members about how they will approach the bill.
I've made it clear that I'll be voting against. the assisted dying bill this time. That's mainly because I don't think that palliative care, end-of-life care, is where it needs to be to give people a real choice.
Last time around, when there was a vote on this in 2015, I voted against bringing forward measures around assisted dying. I've not been persuaded by those arguing for a change at the moment, and I haven't changed my views on this.
I voted for this in 2015 and I will vote for it again. This is a matter of individual conscience for members of parliament, and there are tricky, very difficult, complex issues on both sides. My perspective is that there are people who are approaching end of life, terminally ill people. They have no control at the moment over their lives and their death. And I think that with proper safeguards, that is the right thing to do.
I've just seen too many examples of people who have no choices and no dignity at the end of their lives. And I think the current system is unsustainable.
That was Health Secretary Wes Streeting and Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson saying they'll vote against the bill, and Energy Secretary Ed Miliband and Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy saying they'll vote for it. So those are all answers which have been given over sort of recent days and weeks from Cabinet members. Other Cabinet members who have put forward their stance: Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood and Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds have all said they'll oppose the bill. Meanwhile, Work and Pension Secretary Liz Kendall, Science Secretary Peter Carl and Northern Ireland Secretary Hilary Benn will all vote for it. The Prime Minister Keir Starmer hasn't said how he'll vote, but he's thought to be in the yes camp, while Foreign Secretary David Lammy is likely to vote no. Dalia, this is really one of those issues where it seems to be, completely cut across political divides. And it's an issue where I can absolutely see both sides of the argument. It's sort of, I don't want to be an MP anyway, but it's a situation where I'm actually quite grateful that I don't have to vote on this, because the stakes seem quite high. And I really think both sides have incredibly persuasive arguments. Where do you stand on this?
It's been a while, isn't it, since we've had an issue where you really don't know where people are going to fall. Like, I couldn't have predicted how each of those MPs that you listed would have fallen on this debate. And I think that the reason that it is so unpredictable is because, on the one hand, it's like a deeply individual, personal matter of conscience. But on the other hand, I think it's a position that can change depending on the kind of context in which such a measure is being introduced. For me, I do believe that people should have the right to end their life in a dignified way, in a way that minimizes trauma to themselves and to their loved ones as well. It seems to me ridiculous to tell someone that if they want to end their life, that they shouldn't be entitled to do that. But I also think that the concerns raised are really valid because of the context in which we live. If we lived in a context where palliative care, end-of-life care, adult social care, care for people for disabled people, if we lived in a system where those infrastructures were really comprehensive and really well resourced and really, really good, then I would feel it would feel like a much more empowering choice to say, yes, let's go ahead with assisted suicide, with assisted dying, because then it does feel like genuinely an issue of bodily autonomy. But because we are in a moment where adult social care, whether it's for elderly people or for disabled people, is so awful, is so under-resourced, where people who need long-term or full-time care are literally being treated like disposable lives. In that context, I can understand why there's a sense of trepidation, because it's contextual, right? And for me, I think the corollary here is kind of similar to abortion, although obviously we're talking about bodily autonomy in terms of the person carrying the child, of the mother, where in a reproductive justice framework, in a framework of genuine bodily autonomy, yes, we have, the right to terminate a pregnancy, but as much as we have the right to terminate pregnancy, we also have the right to not terminate a pregnancy, which means that if someone does want to carry a child to term, if someone does want to have a child, that they are not coerced into terminating a pregnancy because the structural conditions make raising a child incredibly difficult if, say, you are working class, or if you don't have, you don't live amongst family or live amongst a community because childcare is too expensive, et cetera, because, there's structural reasons why carrying a pregnancy to term feels impossible. So it really is a kind of contextual issue that, whilst I do certainly believe that, people should be able to terminate their own life in a dignified way, I also think it's understandable that in the particular moment we're in, where the lives of people who require long-term care are treated as disposable, that this could be seen as a way of short-circuiting a social problem and a systemic problem with a kind of quite an extreme medical intervention. I understand why there will be concerns there, but I think fundamentally, if I was an MP, I would probably vote for the bill. I actually a friend of mine happens to have a relative who was part of this lobbying effort to get an assisted dying bill passed. He actually did pass recently, the kind of without assisted dying, of course. But it's very difficult to look at someone in the eye who wants to die and tell them that they don't have a right to. And so I think because of that fundamental sense of yes, the structural conditions do cause concern, but ultimately within that structural condition, people have a right to make those kinds of choices. I think I would probably fall on yes, that we should have the assisted dying bill. I would vote for it.
Yeah, I think I am instinctively yes for assisted dying. I do think I'm not sure how I would vote next week if I was an MP, because it does seem to me that this has been rushed through. And I think that if you're going to pass something like this, a hell of a lot of reassurance needs to be done to the kind of groups who feel like this could disproportionately impact them. So on a recent show, I'll get Gary to put the link underneath this when we sort of re-upload this. I spoke to Liz Carr, who's an actress and an activist with disabilities, who was sort of putting forward very persuasively why some disability activists are very against this. I know there are also other disabled people who are in favor of this. It's not a monolithic group of people. But I feel like the way this has been rushed through, there hasn't been enough time to reassure people who might have those concerns. I totally also agree with you in terms of the background of people having to wait for such a long time to get NHS care, which sort of gives this a bit of a sinister element. But I do also think, even though I'm instinctively in favor of it, I think however well a law is planned, however good our healthcare system is, I do think there will always be inevitable downsides to this. And the reason I say this is because, I think people, when they're coming to the end of their life or when they're older, they already have in the back of their mind this fear: am I becoming a burden to my family? Or the people who love me? Am I eating up the inheritance my children might want? And in a way, sometimes it might be a reassurance to know, well, maybe I am, but what can I do about it, right? And I suppose if you have the choice, and if it's become a social norm that you can make that decision, do you then have this extra worry of, okay, are my kids, even if your kids are like the nicest people in the world and they're not putting any pressure on you at all, might you have in the back of your mind, do they really want me to though? Would it really be kinder for me to sort of hurry this up? And I feel like that could add stress to an already stressful situation. Now, of course, there are loads and loads of downsides to the status quo as well, which is why I think in theory, if this had been given more time, I would vote for assisted dying. But I do think that this is always going to be something where there are really strong arguments on both sides. So any final thoughts on this before we move on?
Yeah, and the strength of those arguments is very much shaped by the context. I think the reason that a lot of disability activists are concerned about this is because we live in a system that politically and economically and socially is indirectly eugenicist. Like people who are not deemed to be economically active, quote unquote, for reasons or because they are elderly, because they are disabled, are treated as burdens and as liabilities and as people who are whose lives are slowly kind of strangled. And so introducing assisted dying in that context is understandably concerning. And the example that you raise of, would people worry that they're eating up into their inheritance, that they're a burden? Like, if we had an adequate, socialized adult social care system, where either people who are relatives of people who require long-term care can get decent wages for taking on that care, or if someone wants to be taken care of by, quote unquote, professional carers, then they have the ability to do that. Then those questions wouldn't be present. So really, the thing that's disturbing us is not so much, I think, the assisted dying. The thing that's disturbing us is that this conversation is highlighting a lot about the way in which society and, the status quo makes life very unbearable for many people who are elderly and who are disabled. It kind of holds a mirror up to our society as it is.
No, I think that's a good point. And I suppose what's very worrying for certain people who feel at the sharp end of that is they say, okay, we've recognized socially we have a problem that we're not treating old people and disabled people as well as we should. Here's the solution: assisted dying. And obviously that does have a sort of certain grimness to it. But that's not to say, I'll be sort of lobbying or shouting at MPs who vote for it, because I think, as is very clear, I think there are two sides to this. A curious feature of the current wave of protests by farmers against inheritance tax reforms is this: the British public are being asked to show sympathy and solidarity with a bunch of relatively wealthy landowners. Now, of course, that's not how the protesters frame themselves. So marching through Whitehall, assembled farmers demanded the government stop killing the people who feed you. I mean, on national news, we heard from many family farmers who complained tax changes could kill their struggling family businesses. And much of the British press have gone with this framing. So the Daily Express led with this particularly heart-rendering front page this morning. So they say, if we don't have a next generation, there will be no future for farming. It is the backbone of this country. Without it, we cannot survive. And then you've got this lovely picture of a young girl on a small tractor with a poster that says, when I grow up, I wanted to be a farmer. And this sort of future has been torn away from her by this change to inheritance tax. It's a effective message. I mean, of course, it would be a shame if young children felt they couldn't keep working on their family business because of these changes. Don't get me wrong. We also, though, shouldn't lose sight of the powerful vested interests who stand to lose from Labour closing inheritance tax loopholes. And someone aware to this fact is Guy Shrubsole. Guy wrote the 2020 book Who Owns Britain, arguing Britain's land is largely owned by a powerful elite who use political influence to protect their privileges. And in September this year, he published The Lie of the Land, arguing we've been hoodwinked by private landowners pretending they are the best possible custodians of our countryside. And I caught up with Guy Shrubsole earlier today. I began by asking him how, given his work over the past few years, he's interpreting the farmers' protests currently hitting Britain.
What I've been seeing is the media doing a pretty bad job of really portraying the context, the reality of how the countryside is used and is owned in the last couple of weeks. I think there's been very much a focus on the understandable concerns of small-scale farmers, but a lot of the people who've been protesting most loudly about changes to inheritance tax rules are some extremely large landowners. Jeremy Clarkson owning 1,000 acres. Just to put that in context, 1,000 acres is bigger than 90% of English farms. We had the Duchess of Rutland writing in the Telegraph about how she didn't want to see changes to agricultural property relief. 20 dukes in this country own 1 million acres of Britain. So these are some of the stats and, facts that I would have hoped to see more coverage of in the mainstream press over the last couple of weeks, as there's been debates about, who should be paying their fair share of tax. So I think there is this, there's this huge sense that the countryside is just the preserve of small scale farmers. And, it would be lovely if that was the case. Perhaps it was the case a very long time ago. But, also for centuries, land in England has been owned by a very small number of people. It's in the hands of, less than 1% of the population who own half the land in England. And that concentration of land ownership also comes with a concentration of wealth, but also of power, political power that is exerted both on Westminster and on government, but also on wider culture. It has helped to create this image that farmers and landowners are simply the custodians of the countryside. It has created the cult of the country house that, we all love the idea of Downton Abbey and of, kind of the Edwardian period and of people, of aristocrats living it up in their country homes. And, I think to be able to really get inside under the skin of that is quite hard in this country. You get accused of sort of politics of envy, or of, this is a taboo to even talk about the ownership of land and all of that, all of what that entails.
To be fair to Jeremy Clarkson, which isn't something I say very often, he was at the demonstration yesterday saying, I'm not here protesting for me, right? He was saying, I know about these issues because I own a farm, but the people I'm here for are the small farm owners, the farmers who say, I'm cash poor, my assets might be worth a fair amount, but what I want to do is pass them down to my children because this farm has been in the family for many generations. So, from your perspective, are there some people on those demonstrations yesterday who did have a point?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Of course, people are right to be concerned about the impacts potentially, but we've got to put this into some perspective, because there's been a lot of misinformation put out over recent weeks about the scale of what's being talked about. Although people are talking about the £1 million agricultural property relief threshold coming in, there are additional nil rate bans for residences and spouses and so on as well, anyway, that the rest of us in the country are able to make use of if we are liable for inheritance tax. Only 4% of the population ever pay inheritance tax anyway. And, inheritance tax is one of those taxes where actually only a small number of people pay it, but a lot of people worry about it. So I can understand people's concerns about this, but I don't think it's been helped by some of the misinformation and sort of rabble rousing that's been done by some people like Jeremy Clarkson, who, when he was interviewed by Victoria Derbyshire yesterday on the protest, he actually said, once again, he admitted that he had bought his farm in order to run it as a shoot originally, and that he knew that it came with the benefit of being exempt from inheritance tax. So, he is an illustration of a trend within the people who own land in England over the last 20 to 30 years who have made use of these tax loopholes in order to invest in farmland, because they knew it would be a way to avoid tax and a way to pass on wealth. I think it's really important that we recognise that as being a really big feature of the countryside in England these days. And then it doesn't serve small-scale farmers to have the price of farmland artificially inflated by wealthy investors who are doing this.
So do you think it's the sort of wealthy landowners like Jeremy Clarkson who are essentially using the small farmers and potentially giving them a false sense of being under attack? Because I suppose what you're saying is that there aren't actually many small farmers who will have to pay inheritance tax even under these changes. But maybe the likes of Jeremy Clarkson are trying to whip up fear, not really to help those small farmers, but to protect themselves, those larger landholders, from paying inheritance tax. Sorry, are we all being scammed essentially in your narrative?
Well, look at what some of the other groups who've been protesting loudly about this have said and have done. We've got the Country Land and Business Association, the CLA. They were literally set up in 1907 as an anti-tax organisation to protest against Lloyd George, who was then the Chancellor, from levying a land value tax. And the Country Land and Business Association's 26,000 members, by their own admission, own a third of the land in England and Wales nowadays. So these are very big landowners indeed, who, I can understand that they don't want to pay their fair share of tax, but they literally have existed for a century and more as a kind of anti-tax lobbying organisation. When we look at the figures, when we actually look at the statistics, and these are government statistics on farm size in England, 60% of farms in England are below 125 acres in size. So that gives you some context for when you hear people like Jeremy Clarkson with his 1,000-acre farm, or the president of the Country Land and Business Association, Lady Victoria Vivian, who owns a 1,000-acre estate in Cornwall, or Andrew Lloyd Webber, who was at the protest yesterday as well, who said he owns farms about 4,000 or 5,000 acres of land in Hampshire. That gives you a sense of how representative they are of landowners. They are not representative of the vast majority of small-scale farms in this country.
And what should the countryside look like? Sometimes I annoy people on this show because I have to admit, I'm from London, I live in London, I'm not an expert on the countryside, but sometimes I flippantly say we should build on more of it. I'm somewhat in favor of building on the greenbelt, and then I say we should also rewild loads of it. So sort of my very ill-informed but sort of instinctive idea is that maybe we don't need so much of it to be these green fields that all look quite similar, and more of it could be rewilded, more of it could be built on. We could build a few more reservoirs. I suppose now I'm sort of privileged enough to be speaking to someone who does actually know about these things. What do you think Britain's countryside should look like if we were being ambitious and imaginative?
Well, I certainly think we should be building more affordable housing. I think we should be doing that in a structured, planned way through having a new generation of new towns and, creating places where people want to live and work, and that they're affordable housing, and that we're using land in a way that is basically, we're allowing councils to acquire land and development corporations, as in public development corporations, to acquire land a bit closer to existing use value, and that would allow more affordable housing to be built. But the rest of the countryside, well, look, 70% of the UK is farmed. It's, used for agriculture. 10% is 10 to 13% actually. 13% of the UK is forested, but half of that at least is conifer monocultures that are doing very little for nature, for biodiversity, and very sadly, a large portion of the farmland nowadays is not farmed in a traditional way, low intensity way that we might think of as being kind of traditional farming. It is farmed with, pesticides, huge amounts of chemicals, and very intensively in ways that is, overstocked with livestock and cattle and sheep and so on, leading to overgrazing issues. And I absolutely think there is a space, an absolute need for rewilding of some parts of our landscapes, but there's also a need for a much lighter, nature-friendly form of farming to be adopted across large swathes of our countryside. And there are fantastic examples of farmers trying to do this. People like James Rebanks in the Lake District, as I say, organisations like Netwilding that are trying to do work on their estate in Sussex. But I think that there is a spectrum of what we need in terms of nature restoration in this country. It isn't all or nothing. It's not all intensify everything in this area and rewild that area. It's a kind of a spectrum of nature-friendly farming, restoring things like hedgerows, many of which have been grubbed out, restoring areas of deciduous woodland. Why not also, if we're talking about green belts, as you were just then, why don't we green the green belt and make it more accessible so that where we have, people living close by to areas of green belt, maybe some of those new towns as well, that there is actually also a beautiful countryside next door to where people live that's made more accessible. And then that actually lives up to the name of Greenbelt in the first place.
That was Guy Shrubsole speaking to me earlier today. If you want to hear more from Guy, my colleague Aaron Bastani did a brilliant interview with him about a month ago on Downstream. I think we'll probably put that link in the description box as well. I should also say thank you for the commenter who pointed out that it's heart-rending, not heart-rendering, almost as embarrassing as 2 weeks ago when I called Aaron my erstwhile colleague, which I didn't know would have meant he would have resigned. You're always improving my grammar and vocabulary every week on this show, which I do very much appreciate. Let's go to our final story. The U.S. Senate is set to vote on a measure that would block $20 billion worth of arms sales to Israel. Introduced by Bernie Sanders, the vote on the joint resolutions of disapproval will be the first Senate vote of its kind. This was Sanders speaking ahead of the vote.
Clearly, what is happening in Gaza today is unspeakable. But what makes it even more painful is that much of what is happening there has been done with U.S. weapons and with American taxpayer support. In the last year alone, the U.S. has provided $18 billion in military aid to Israel and delivered more than 50,000 tons of military equipment. In other words, and this is the most important point to be made, the United States of America is complicit in these atrocities. That complicity must end, and that is what these resolutions are about. It is time to tell the Netanyahu government that they cannot use U.S. taxpayer dollars and American weapons in violation of U.S. and international law and in violation of our moral values.
If passed, the resolutions would block the sale of up to 50 new F-15 fighter jets, high-explosive mortar rounds, tank rounds, and armoured vehicles. But while Sanders has some high-profile supporters in the Senate, including Elizabeth Warren, it's not clear how much support the resolutions will get from the rest of the Democratic bloc in the Senate. The Democrats currently enjoy a slim majority of 2 in the Senate. The Republicans are almost certain to try to quash it, with incoming Senate Majority Leader John Thune saying this.
To our allies in Israel and to the Jewish people around the world, my message to you is this: reinforcements are on the way. Senate Republicans reclaim the majority in 6 weeks, and when we do, we will make clear that the United States Congress stands squarely in Israel's corner, and we will help the Trump-Vance administration defend Israel and promote peace in the region.
It's funny, isn't it? And lots of the sort of definitions of anti-Semitism, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which was dodgy in many ways, one of the things it says is anti-Semitic is to conflate Jewish people with the state of Israel. Now, I agree that is anti-Semitic, but then you've got the Republican Senate or incoming Senate Majority Leader saying that I'm reassuring not just the Israelis, but every Jew in the world, the world's Jewish people, that we are going to give Israel unlimited arms to continue their genocide against the Palestinian people. Now, one of the ironies of this bill is that the US government is already in breach of a promise it made to cut arms transfers to Israel. Back in October, the Biden administration gave Israel 30 days to increase humanitarian aid into Gaza or face cuts to military support. Israel ignored that deadline, which passed last week, and yet Israel arms sales are still continuing. Ahead of that vote, protesters against the arms trade with Israel also occupied the Senate building in support of Sanders' bill, carrying banners reading "Fund Jobs, Not Israel" and "Arms Embargo Now." Most protesters amassed in the building's atrium, while others threw pamphlets from higher floors. But they were swiftly greeted with police aggression, with almost 100 people arrested. The protesters came from a broad coalition of groups and included Palestinians, Jews, climate activists, veterans, and indigenous people. In a statement, Sandra Tamari, executive director of the Dalia Justice Project, said this: "Every day we keep sending weapons to Israel is a day dozens of Palestinian children and families are horrifically murdered using our tax dollars. This week, senators will clearly go on the record with their stance on genocide in the first vote in US history to directly block weapons to Israel." And there's also a quote from Jewish Voice for Peace member Eliana Fishman. "American Jews are sick and tired of the US government using Jewish safety as a justification for funding the slaughter of Palestinians and Lebanese men, women, and children." The Senate vote on the resolutions will come just hours after the US once again vetoed a Security Council resolution calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza at the United Nations. All the other 14 members of the Security Council, including the UK, voted in favour of it. So previously we've often sort of abstained on votes such as that. Now we are voting in favor of unconditional ceasefires. Of course, though, it doesn't mean that much if the United States are still vetoing. Dalia, I very much doubt this bill will pass. This is not the sort of agenda that US senators tend to sign up to. Is it still meaningful to have sort of Bernie Sanders putting this forward?
It is. I mean, first of all, there's no moral or ethical or legal basis on which the US should not pass this resolution, on which the US should continue to supply arms to Israel. Genocides are rarely ruled genocides until quite a long time after they are completed. But in terms of the information that we have, the markers of a genocide, we have the ICJ ruling, we have concerns from the UN, we have enough information to know that there is a plausible risk of genocide taking place. All of the markers for that at this point have been cleared. And so the US continuing to supply arms is them continuing to supply arms to a state that there is reasonable there are reasonable grounds to believe is committing genocide, and that is illegal under international law. So there is no actual basis other than very short-term political reasons for why the US would continue to arm Israel and would not vote through this resolution. Unfortunately, not only do we have a situation whereby this resolution is unlikely to pass, but the particular fact that the US issued an ultimatum about, over a month ago to say you have 30 days to allow in humanitarian aid, otherwise you risk a reduction in military support. And we have, 8 international humanitarian aid agencies have come out and said that Israel have not cleared the benchmarks of that ultimatum. And yet, not only is the US not going to implement the ultimatum, but they're actually going to be in this peculiar and very kind of just sinister position where they're not only going to not withdraw military support, but they're actually likely going to pass a resolution that doubles down on that military support. And so it is important, I think, for Bernie Sanders to introduce this bill, because I think it's important to raise these things to the surface. I think it's way too late. The minute that the ICJ came through with that ruling that there is plausible risk that Israel is committing genocide, according to international law, it would have been entirely reasonable to demand at a Senate level that the US should withdraw arms support for a state that is at plausible risk of committing genocide. But the reason that we aren't seeing these shifts, and I think it's important for Bernie Sanders to force that contradiction to the fore, to force people to actually make a statement so that we don't just listen to these annoying aphorisms about we're working behind, working tirelessly behind the scenes for a ceasefire. Actually, when you're put to it, you need to put your name on record, and the historical record, that over a year since this genocide began, you are still signing away billions of dollars of worth of weapons to the state of Israel. But, the reason that this resolution is not likely to pass is because particularly when it comes to international policy, the US is not a democracy, and it is not a force for peace and justice, unless by peace you mean the total annihilation and silencing and ethnic cleansing of particular groups of people to the point where there aren't even enough people left to mount a resistance to their oppression. And part of this is because of, powerful lobbying interests, Christians United for Israel, AIPAC, etc. But much more broadly than that, much more of a broader reason as to why, particularly when it comes to this issue, the US is not a democracy and it's not a force for peace and justice, is because it shares the geopolitical goals of Israel, which is for the Arab world, Middle East and North Africa, to be colonized for its resources, to be colonized for its labor force, to be colonized for the strategic, geographic position that it occupies in the world. And so, in a sense, whilst they might sometimes there might be discrepancies between some US administrations and Israel on the details of it, but the broad brush strokes is an exchange of full loyalty because of a shared geopolitical interest in colonizing the region. And until the US can find a different vehicle through which to colonize the region, they are going to continue to be loyal to Israel, even if it is actually in violation of international law, which the US is signed up to.
Let's wrap up. Dalia, Gebrial, it's been fantastic having you on this evening.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
And thank you guys for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.